Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
I love what you do for me, Toyota. I love how you set me free, Toyota.
Toyota's new four-wheel drive, four-door 4Runner for 1990. Space, luxury, and V6 power. Where you go is your concern.
Oh, how I love it.
Getting you back
I love what you do for
is
me,
ours.
Toyota.
He's back. All you had to do was ask. Super Mario Bros. 3 from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
Because the best way to survive an accident is not to get into one.
More movies, more nights, more fun.
Blockbuster Video. Wow, what a difference!
The inevitable has happened. American, British, French and Kuwaiti planes bombed targets throughout Iraq and Kuwait as dawn broke in the Middle East today. Cruise missiles, F-15 stealth bombers and British Tornadoes were used in the first wave of attacks. President Bush is about to address the American people from the White House regarding the military operation, now referred to as Operation Desert Storm.
Our objectives are clear. Saddam Hussein's forces will leave Kuwait. The legitimate government of Kuwait will be restored to its rightful place, and Kuwait will once again be free. Iraq will eventually comply with all relevant United Nations resolutions, and then, when peace is restored, it is our hope that Iraq will live as a peaceful and cooperative member of the family of nations, thus enhancing the security and stability of the Gulf. Saddam was warned over and over again to comply with the will of the United Nations. Leave Kuwait or be driven out. Saddam has arrogantly rejected all warnings. Instead, he tried to make this a dispute between Iraq and the United States of America. Well, he failed. Tonight, 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. These countries had hoped the use of force could be avoided. Regrettably, we now believe that only force will make him leave.
The Cold War, a constant cycle of proclaimed good and evil. The battle of two superpowers. America, a country that has practiced isolationism in their early years, has now developed a mantra of interventionism, keeping their values and the others who value the same things safe. This was spurred on by the constant threat of communism. Enter Kuwait, a small nation carved out of the British Empire of old. Kuwait, like so many other nations in the Middle East, was reliant on oil production. Iraq, Kuwait's neighbor, was no exception to this. Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein was a ruthless dictator and hungry for recognition on the world stage. This lust of power led him to invade Kuwait. This invasion would give him access and control over the vast amount of oil.
The Iran-Iraq War was a brutal conflict that lasted around 8 years. The Iraqi leader, Saddam Hussein, had launched this conflict in order to stop the spreading of the Islamic Revolution. This conflict against Iran pulled Iraq into a mountain of debt, owed mostly to its neighbors, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Saddam wanted both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to forgive his debts, but both refused. Saddam also wanted to be able to produce over his OPEC quota to help repay his debts. Again, they refused. To make matters worse, Kuwait and other members of OPEC were constantly overproducing and flooding the market with cheap oil. This drove the price down further. Saddam claimed that this was economic warfare against Iraq. He used this, along with the fact that Kuwait was caught slant drilling across into Iraq, to justify a military buildup and eventual invasion. On the 2nd of August, 1990, 100,000 Iraqi troops flooded across the border into Kuwait. It only took Saddam 2 days to take Kuwait due to the fact that Kuwait had little to no standing army. The United Nations, quick to act, condemned this invasion and implemented a host of economic sanctions on Iraq. To the world, it looked like Saddam was not just going to stop with the invasion of Kuwait, but push further down to take Saudi Arabia. This would give Saddam access to a large chunk of the world's oil reserves, and he could use this to wreak havoc among the world's economies. The United States, along with help from the United Nations, quickly launched Operation Desert Shield, a plan to protect Saudi Arabia from Saddam and his forces. A U.S.-led coalition was formed, 39 countries, including some members from the Arab League. A total of 58,000 coalition troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia, ready to act at a moment's notice. Still, the Iraqi army held firm under the orders of Saddam. Saddam's master plan was to draw the U.S. and coalition forces into a Vietnam-like situation, to inflict mass casualties and hope that the world populace would turn against the war. Iraq continued to ignore all UN resolutions through any attempts at peace. When the peace talks went nowhere, U.S. President George Bush Sr. decided it was better to enter a risky ground combat to remove Saddam from Kuwait. On the 17th of January, 1991, Operation Desert Storm was launched, a mass aerial bombardment of military targets in Kuwait and all across Iraq. Aircraft from all major nations of the coalition crossed into hostile airspace, armed with the new generation precision rockets and later laser-guided smart bombs. They were tasked with taking out key targets to sever the Iraqi military structure and communication networks. Iraq retaliated by launching 12 Scud missiles toward Israel. 12 people were killed in these attacks. Saddam hoped that these attacks would break apart the coalition by getting Israel involved. Arab members of the coalition would in no way participate if Israel was involved. The U.S. convinced Israel not to retaliate by supplying them with a new Patriot missile defense system. With this, Israel agreed to stay out of the conflict. Iraqi troops were also ordered to destroy and burn Kuwaiti oil fields. Around 600 of them were set ablaze. Along with this, Iraq also started dumping crude oil into the Persian Gulf to deny the coalition force any chance at a beach landing. This is noted to be the world's largest oil spill, with between 80 and 1,000 tons of crude oil being dumped into the Gulf. Saddam also continually denied any resolutions of peace brought forth by the UN or the US. He was determined to go to war. He promised the coalition force that there would be a mother of all battles about to commence. On the 29th of January, 1991, Saddam does the unthinkable. Iraqi forces crossed the Saudi Arabian border to invade the border town of Khafji. The Iraqi forces are quickly engaged by U.S. Marines, alongside Saudi and Qatari troops. This would be the first ground combat of the war. By the 1st of February, the Iraqi forces are pushed out, and this would be the only time Saddam's army would ever push forward into Saudi Arabia.
Now I'm going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right through the crosshairs.
On the 22nd of February 1991, U.S. President George Bush had issued a final 24-hour ultimatum to Iraq. Leave Kuwait or risk a ground war. This is exactly what Saddam was hoping for. Draw the U.S. into a risky ground war and inflict mass casualties. Saddam's mother of all battles was on his doorstep. And on the 24th of February, coalition forces crossed over the sand berms leading into Kuwait and Iraq, led by advance units from the British SAS, or the Special Air Service. The Iraqi forces had been battered for 38 days by the air campaign and offered little to no resistance, and on the 25th of February, almost 20,000 Iraqi troops have surrendered, and by the end of that month, over 100,000 troops had surrendered to the coalition forces. This loss of troops was something Saddam was never able to recover from. Saddam's army had been made up of mostly draftees left over from the Iran-Iraq War. After the continuous air campaign led by the coalition, most of them had no will left to fight and quickly surrendered to the coalition ground troops. Saddam, realizing that he was losing so many troops, was now relying on his elite Republican Guard units, the best of the Iraqi troops, and the only hope left to slow the coalition's advance. But they too were quickly wiped out under the might of American armor and air superiority. Saddam had greatly underestimated the coalition and its military might. Also on the 25th of February, Saddam had ordered a Scud missile attack on Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, which killed 28 American troops and had injured 98 civilians. This would be one of the last offensives Saddam would ever launch against the coalition. For on the 26th of February, Saddam announced that he would withdraw from Kuwait and accept all resolutions. Hearing this, a large number of Iraqi troops fled north on a main highway. They took military and civilian vehicles. This large convoy was spotted from the air and subsequently attacked for 2 days straight. This stretch of road became known as the Highway of Death, due to all the debris and carnage strewn about the highway. The exact death toll is unknown, but around 10,000 Iraqi troops were killed. Coalition forces entered Kuwait City on the 27th of February, and by the 28th, U.S. President George Bush Sr. had announced a ceasefire. Iraq accepted the terms of the ceasefire and all of the UN resolutions. The war was now over, and the world was once again at peace for the moment.
A Cold War-era conflict, not led by ideological struggles, but by collective will to accomplish a goal. This goal was to free Kuwait from its oppressors and restore peace to the Middle East. This conflict was not hampered by the ever-so-prevalent disillusion during the majority of the Cold War. The coalition was able to achieve its goal in under 2 months with minimal casualties, while inflicting 40,000 to the enemy. Saddam's plan to draw the U.S. into another Vietnam had failed, and he was defeated.
America and the world drew a line in the sand. We declared that the aggression against Kuwait would not stand. And tonight, America and the world have kept their word. This is not a time of euphoria, certainly not a time to gloat, but it is a time of pride. Pride in our troops, pride in the friends who stood with us in the crisis, pride in our nation, and the people whose strength and resolve made victory quick, decisive, and just. And soon, we will open wide our arms to welcome back home to America our magnificent fighting forces. No one country can claim this victory as its own. It was not only a victory for Kuwait, but a victory for all the coalition partners. This is a victory for the United Nations, for all mankind.
Although the coalition was ultimately successful in its main goal, to remove Saddam from Kuwait, it was brought down by one thing. Saddam was still in power in Iraq. They stopped short of invading Iraq to remove Saddam because he was willing to comply for the moment. But he was still a constant threat. The coalition's failure to do so had condemned them to a life of commitment in the Middle East to contain the Iraqi leader and his army. This constant Western presence in the Gulf, along with continuous sanctions against Iraq, spurred on a hatred of the West among the Iraqi leadership and jihadists. They would use this as a rallying cry, and it would ultimately culminate in the acts of September 11th, 2001.
On September 11th, 2001, members of Al-Qaeda launched an attack on the United States. 19 terrorists acting on behalf of Osama bin Laden hijacked 4 commercial planes and acted out a coordinated attack of terrorism. 8:46, Flight 11 flew into the North Tower, killing everyone aboard and hundreds inside. It made contact with floors 91 to 99. At 8:50, George Bush, who is visiting Emma E. Booker's elementary school, is informed of the attack on New York and the potential attacks incoming. Then, at 9:03, United Airlines Flight 175 flew into the South Tower, killing everyone aboard, and many of the civilians that the government did not allow to evacuate died. Now, the reason, we believe, it wasn't evacuated is because the officials in New York City were not told about the hijackings only hours before, and probably thought it was just an airline accident. They didn't want to create pandemonium. Later, at 9:37, a third flight, Flight 77, flew into the western facade of the Pentagon. This triggered a chain reaction across the country to evacuate all landmarks and government buildings of importance, like the White House. Now you're probably wondering about the fourth plane. The plane nobody really talks about. Flight 93. Flight 93 was on its way to Washington, but once passengers on the plane started to rebel, the hijackers crashed it into Somerset County, Pennsylvania.
These actions on September 11th cut the American populace deep. Not since the Second World War had the U.S. been attacked on their own soil. The U.S. government under George W. Bush launched the War on Terror in response to this. Their target was Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. They were now fighting the same side they had supported and supplied during the Cold War to kick the USSR out of Afghanistan. But this soon escalated to an invasion of Iraq, under the guise that the Iraqi leadership, still under Saddam Hussein, had procured WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. Once again, the Middle East was thrown into conflict, with a large target on Saddam's back. The U.S. now would follow through and remove Saddam from complete power. The WMDs that had brought the U.S. back to Iraq were never found. This action, for a large part, discredited the Bush government at the time. With Saddam removed from power, a power vacuum erupted in Iraq. This prompted many military and also militant groups to vie for power. Although many of them were different, they all had one common goal: kick the U.S. out of the Middle East. The U.S. was then able to keep control of these groups for very long, and they were soon thrown back into combat. This combat was difficult due to the fact that the militants blended right in to the general populace, and guerrilla warfare for the most part is difficult to combat. This fighting dragged on for many years, until recently, when the U.S. decided to withdraw from the Middle East. Years and years of conflict caused by a small war at the very tail end of the Cold War. The first Gulf War had shown the world what could be accomplished if they all worked together, but subsequent ones had accomplished nothing except to draw more hatred towards the U.S. and its world policies. Thank you.
At night so I can see their flashes.
Yeah, it'd be a lot easier to... Okay. They ain't alive no more, that's...